A camera held at shoulder height moves through the paved corridor beneath Center City, where the city's surface noise is reduced to a vibration in the ceiling. There are places down here where the tile has been repaired so many times that the pattern no longer matches itself. There are corners where the fluorescent light does not reach. There are service doors set into walls that look identical to the rest of the station until you stand close enough to see the seams. This is the Broad Street Line, Philadelphia's north-south subway, built to move people quickly under Broad Street and through the city's administrative core. Work began in 1924, and the first segment opened for service on September 1, 1928, carrying riders between City Hall and Olney Avenue. The early accounts emphasize scale: earth removed, concrete poured, steel set into place below streets that never stopped being used. The system was designed as permanent infrastructure, the kind of construction that assumes it will be maintained and understood long after the people who built it are gone. The unease does not come from age alone. It comes from what remains accessible and what does not. At City Hall, the Broad Street Line passes under the seat of municipal government, in a section where you can hear other rail systems moving overhead and beside it. The station is a convergence of lines and corridors, a place where the design has to accommodate crowds and foundations and curves all at once. Accounts of its geometry describe how the building's foundations push into the station space, dividing the platforms and shaping passages that were never meant to be elegant, only sufficient. The soundscape is layered: trains, ventilation, the distant scrape of trolleys. In some spots, you can feel a train pass above you as a physical pressure in the air, as if the ceiling is briefly pressed down by weight. But this documentary is not about the platforms that fill and empty on schedule. It is about the others. The story starts earlier than the Broad Street Line itself, in a set of plans drawn when Philadelphia was still imagining what it might become. In 1913, Transit Commissioner A. Merritt Taylor proposed a rapid transit expansion that included not only the Broad Street and Market Frankford lines, but a Center City Loop, a circulation route intended to move trains around downtown streets, Broad to Ridge to 8th, down toward Locust, west, north, and back again. The construction began on pieces of that vision, but money and timing and politics intervened. A loop requires continuity. Without it, each partial tunnel becomes a decision deferred. Some of what was built was eventually used. In 1932, the Broad Ridge Spur opened, running with the Broad Street Line until it diverged near Fairmount and cut toward Center City. It was intended as part of something larger, but it remained a branch, functional, but always slightly out of place. Later reporting describes it as obscure enough that riders still board it by accident, expecting an express train and arriving instead at a platform they did not intend to see. The branch is not empty. It is simply quieter than the rest of the system. WHYY's description of waiting on the spur is clinical and accurate. Flickering fluorescent light, distant rumbling from other tracks, and long intervals where you can hear your own breathing as an element of the station's acoustics. On the spur, you can stand alone long enough to begin doubting the reliability of time. You watch an LED display cycle through practical information and oddly philosophical messages, brief, declarative lines that are not incorrect but feel misplaced in a tunnel built of concrete and exhaust. The numbers are explicit. While the Market Frankford line moves about 190,000 riders a day and the Broad Street line about 120,000, the Spur sees around 8,000. Less traffic means less noise. Less noise means more space for thought. Where the Spur is quiet, the abandoned places are quieter still. The Spring Garden station on the Broad Ridge Spur was closed decades after it opened. Streets Dept notes it was closed in 1989, citing low ridership and safety concerns, and describes it now as an abandoned interior that still bears the station's original structure. Other accounts cite slightly different closure years, and that discrepancy matters. It matters because the system produces records, and yet the public memory of what happened does not align with a single date. The station exists in that gap, not fully remembered, not fully documented in the way a modern closure would be documented, not fully erased. And then there is Fairmount. StreetStepped describes Fairmount as still partially open but left fairly untouched, with what appeared to be at least half of the platform closed to the public. That is a station people pass through without fully seeing. A fence line can reduce an environment by half, and the half that remains becomes normal. The sealed half becomes background. Most riders do not ask where it goes. They rarely notice that the tile continues beyond the fence, that the platform edge continues, that the curve of the tunnel implies a space meant for more people than are allowed to stand there now. In Philadelphia, abandonment rarely looks like collapse. It looks like a gate. Sometimes it looks like a door with a new lock on an old frame. Sometimes it looks like a stairway blocked at the top, as if the street has decided it does not want to be connected to the station anymore. Riders are trained to accept these adjustments as maintenance, as safety, as ordinary changes in a system that cannot be shut down for long. But the title of this story, Sealed Without Warning, points to a specific kind of closure, a closure that does not announce itself in the language writers recognize. StreetStepped, describing the risks of entering abandoned stations, is direct. Trespassing is illegal, dangerous, and disorienting. Active third rail can electrocute. Tunnels are narrow. Trains move fast. And when trains pass, the air displacement can create a pull toward the tracks. These are not cinematic details. They are the reality of an operating subway, and they are the reason closures happen quickly when something becomes unmanageable. What is harder to explain is why some places are not merely closed, but made to feel as if they were never supposed to exist. An archival photograph of City Hall Station shows the familiar geometry of island platforms and columns and track, framed in a way that makes the station feel like a room carved out of the city's foundation rather than an amenity built for the public. You can look at such images and understand that every accessible area has an equal and opposite inaccessible one. Service voids, utility corridors, unused passages left from earlier construction. The sealed platforms belong to that hidden half, but they are not purely hypothetical. They are mapped, they are built, they are present in the system's own descriptions of itself, embedded among ordinary station-by-station inventories and design notes. The camera returns to the mezzanine level and stops on a plain wall. The tile is newer than the surrounding tile, slightly different in sheen. The grout lines do not perfectly match. The wall is too clean for a subway. If you stand there long enough, you can hear the system behind it. A subway system teaches its users to think in straight lines. Northbound, southbound, next stop, last stop. The Broad Street line complicates that with a feature that is easy to overlook unless you have reason to study it. For much of its length, it was built with 4 tracks, arranged for local and express service, a physical acknowledgement that not every rider is going to the same place at the same speed. That arrangement increases capacity and reduces travel time, but it also increases the amount of structure underground. More track bed, more switches, more crossovers, more signal blocks, more ventilation needs, more places where a failure can isolate one segment from another. The Broad Ridge Spur complicates it further. It runs with the Broad Street line until it diverges and angles away, a branch that exists because a larger loop was started and never finished. Billy Penn describes that original ambition, multiple downtown lines, a more robust network, and then describes what remained, a short, orphaned line that survives by being just useful enough. It is a transit artifact that still carries commuters, but also carries the geometry of an abandoned plan. The engineering of this arrangement depends on junctions and grades that have to work every day. At Fairmount, the spur meets the main line environment, and the infrastructure has to manage different levels, different alignments, and the constraints imposed by the streets above. When a station is described as partially open, that partiality often follows engineering logic. A section that is difficult to monitor, difficult to maintain, or difficult to keep safe can be fenced off without reducing service to zero. What riders experience as a simple fence is, from an operations perspective, a boundary between two different risk profiles. The documentary record of closures often emphasizes ridership and budget. For the Spur, those factors are explicit. WHYY's ridership comparison makes the imbalance visible. 8,000 daily riders on the Spur is not nothing, but it is a small number in a system where other lines carry an order of magnitude more. That lower usage changes what the stations feel like and how they are staffed and maintained. Quiet stations are not only quieter, they are lonelier, and loneliness is a safety factor. Billy Penn documents how, in the years before the Gallery Mall closed for redevelopment, the Spur's 8th Street station saw around 840,000 annual riders, and how ridership dropped by roughly 25% after the mall shut down. The article describes repeated periods when officials considered cutting service entirely. 2003, then again in the years surrounding a statewide budget crisis. The Spur's survival is not treated as guaranteed, it is treated as contingent, revisited, rejustified. Contingency creates a particular kind of neglect, not the neglect of collapse, but the neglect of postponement. Stations are not renovated because their future is unclear. Equipment is kept running because it must be, but not replaced because it might be removed. The result is a system that functions and still feels provisional. In that context, the sealing of platforms becomes easier to understand and harder to accept. A sealed platform is a statement that a space has crossed a threshold, not closed for the night, not under repair with an expected return, closed in a way that implies it should no longer be part of the rider's mental map. When this is done gradually, riders adapt. When it is done quickly, overnight, without familiar signage, it creates an informational void. People fill informational voids with rumor, and rumor becomes more persistent than fact when the space in question is physically inaccessible. Street-stepped, warning against trespassing, describes abandoned stations as labyrinthine, dozens of pitch-black hallways, sealed exits, thick dust, and utility rooms that turn into dead ends. The danger is not abstract, it is the combination of a working rail corridor and a closed civic interior. A person can be within yards of crowds and still be in a place where a fall is fatal and a scream is absorbed by concrete. The early warnings about the sealed Broad Street line platforms were not in most accounts warnings given to riders. They were the kinds of warnings that appear in maintenance culture, things that staff tell each other, things that show up as informal rules. Former operators describe station geometry as an occupational memory. They do not remember every poster, but they remember curves where visibility is limited, crossovers where a train can be moved to bypass an obstruction, and places where the noise changes in a way that implies a cavity behind a wall. The main line system, with its local and express tracks, has multiple crossovers and interlockings that allow trains to be rerouted in emergencies. Those features are essential, and they are also the reason certain spaces cannot be left accessible if people begin using them for unauthorized purposes. The Broad Ridge Spur's abandoned Spring Garden Station became, by multiple public accounts, a graffiti-covered interior, an unintentional gallery created by disuse. Billy Penn notes that the station now functions as a kind of visual archive of what the line became after it stopped serving passengers. Street-stepped describes abandoned stations as havens for street art after decades of neglect. The system, in effect, created a room that would be filled once it was no longer supervised. That filling is part of the horror.
a civic space repurposed without permission, not by redevelopment, but by the slow accumulation of unsanctioned presence. It is not supernatural. It is what happens when a room is left unattended in a city that has people who need shelter, privacy, and places to be unseen. When writers speak about sealed platforms, they rarely describe them as beautiful or historic. They describe them as wrong. A wall where a corridor should be, a gate where a stairway used to be, a section of platform that feels as if it should still exist because it still can be glimpsed, briefly, through fencing or from a moving train. An image of Fairmount Station shows a standard transit environment on the surface: signage, structure, the ordinary texture of tile and steel. But the same station is described in exploration accounts as containing a closed portion that feels untouched, as if it had simply been paused. That paused quality, space preserved by being denied, produces a specific psychological effect. It is like finding an office with the lights off where the desks are still set up. It implies interruption rather than completion. The Broad Street line itself has been extended and modified over time. Philly history describes extensions southward and northward, incremental completion, and the slow achievement of the line that exists today. The system's public face is expansion, improvement, continuation. But in parallel, beneath that story, is a quieter one: the creation of dead platforms inside a living system. Spaces that were built to be used, then abandoned, then sealed. To understand what happened when they were sealed without warning, it is necessary to consider a basic operational reality. Rail systems do not tolerate ambiguity. A space is either part of the controlled environment or it is a vulnerability. Once a sealed platform becomes known as a place people can enter, it stops being merely unused. It becomes a risk that can propagate into the working line through trespasses, through fires, through accidents, through the unpredictable presence of people where operators do not expect them. The camera moves closer to another wall, and the audio tightens. Behind the surface noise of the station, there's a low, repetitive mechanical note: ventilation, steady and indifferent. It is the sound of a system designed to keep air moving through rooms that are no longer supposed to hold people. The darkest period of an urban transit system is rarely the moment of a single catastrophe. It is the period when small failures become normal, when workarounds become routine, when staff stop expecting conditions to improve and begin managing decline as a permanent state. For the Broad Ridge Spur, the public record contains the elements of that decline: low ridership, repeated threats of cancellation, and a station, Spring Garden, closed and left behind. Billy Penn describes the Spur as plagued by low ridership and by administrative consideration of shutting it down. It documents the closure of the Spur's Spring Garden stop and describes it as a graffiti-covered remnant. Street Stepped describes entering an abandoned station as moving through dust, sealed exits, and dark hallways that lead to utility rooms and locked doors. It emphasizes the physical dangers: active third rail, narrow tunnels, the vacuum effect created by passing trains. The description is not poetic, but it does not need to be. It is enough to know that a moving train can pull air, and with it a human body, toward the track bed if that body is too close. Those dangers shaped what happened in the late years before sealing became complete. Transit police and operators rarely speak publicly in detail about trespass patterns at specific stations. What emerges instead are fragments, stories that circulate among staff, warnings delivered as procedure rather than narrative. Certain stairways were to be monitored more closely, certain gates were to be checked for tampering. Certain doorways that looked like storage were not storage. People who worked nights on the line learned which areas were likely to contain someone who should not be there and which areas were likely to contain someone who could not leave. In systems like this, the line between abandoned platform and occupied platform is not always visible in the daylight. The occupation can be temporary. It can be a person sleeping, a person hiding, a person painting, a person waiting for something. The platform itself remains part of the subterranean city, and the city has its own uses for empty rooms. The sealed without warning closures appear in staff recollection as a response to a series of incidents that did not individually justify public attention, but collectively forced a decision. There are always a few categories that recur in closed infrastructure. A person found in a restricted area who cannot explain how they got there. A small fire that leaves smoke staining the tile and requires an overnight ventilation purge. A tool left behind by maintenance crews that is later found moved. A gate cut and retied so cleanly that it is not noticed until someone pushes on it. These are not dramatic events. They are administrative problems. They are also the kinds of problems that cannot be solved by signage alone, because the people who enter abandoned platforms do not tend to be the people who obey posted instructions. The broad street line's complexity amplifies the consequences. The presence of express and local tracks means trains can pass at different speeds and with different expectations of platform activity. A station that is quiet in the middle of the day can be loud enough at rush hour that an unauthorized presence is masked by normal noise. The Spur, with its lower ridership and longer intervals, offers time for someone to move through a station without being seen. WYYY's description of isolation on the Spur, standing alone under fluorescent light, listening to trains on some other track, is, in a different context, a description of vulnerability. A rider waiting alone is vulnerable. A worker inspecting equipment alone is vulnerable. And an unauthorized person moving through the station is protected by that same isolation. During the period when Spring Garden was closed and left behind, it became a place that invited entry precisely because it was no longer part of the official route. StreetStepped notes that abandoned stations became havens for street art, with tags and murals accumulating over decades. What begins as graffiti becomes navigation, an informal signage system for people who know the tunnels. Dates are written into paint, names become repeated. A room that no longer belongs to the transit authority becomes, in practice, owned by whoever can reach it. At a certain point, the system responds the way systems respond, by sealing. The phrase "without warning" is not about the absence of internal planning, it is about the absence of public ritual. Riders did not receive a final week of signs, a ceremonial last train, a clear statement that a space would be removed from their city. Instead, the closures appear in memory as abrupt physical changes: a gate installed overnight, a corridor blocked, a stairway that led to daylight now ending in a new wall.
When closures are done this way, they produce a psychological residue. People continue to look for what used to be there. They test doors, they ask station agents, they point out the change to friends. The question becomes less why is it closed, and more what happened that they closed it like that. The Broad Ridge Spur's Sunday shutdown adds another layer. Billy Penn notes that the Spur is closed on Sundays, a schedule oddity in a major city rail network. A line that is closed one day a week creates recurring periods when stations are dark and empty by design. Those dark periods are predictable, and predictability is useful to people who want to enter spaces unnoticed. The system's response, sealing platforms more completely, can be understood as a recognition of that vulnerability. Even improvements can feel ominous when placed against this history. Billy Penn describes an $8 million signal upgrade intended to bring the Spur up to the automatic train control standard used elsewhere, citing safety benefits like preventing speeding and detecting broken rail. Better signaling is necessary, but it also means the system is watching itself more closely. When a system begins monitoring more, it is often because it has learned it cannot trust conditions to remain stable on their own. There are also the parts of the original loop plan that were never put into service at all. StreetStepped notes that while some tunnels were repurposed, other sections, like the portion under Arch Street, were never used. An unused tunnel is a sealed platform in its earliest form.
space built for people, then denied to them for generations. The camera returns to a corridor where the public path narrows. The lens lingers on a locked metal door with scuffs at the bottom edge, the kind of scuffing that suggests repeated contact, a foot testing it, a maintenance cart striking it, a shoulder leaning in. The sound of trains continues, indifferent and regular. The darkest period ends not with an announcement, but with a reduction, a little less access, a few more locked gates, a platform shortened behind fencing, a station closed and left to fill itself with whatever the city sends down. After the sealing, the system continues to operate, and that continuation becomes its own form of silence. The Broad Street line still carries riders through the same core stations that opened early in the system's history. Philly History's account of the line emphasizes steady development, extensions southward, later additions northward, the completion of the route as it exists today. The public narrative of a transit system prefers this kind of story, a line built, expanded, maintained. But sealed platforms do not fit cleanly into that narrative because they represent subtraction. They represent the city deciding, quietly, that certain built spaces are no longer safe to be part of public life. In 2018, SEPTA published a statement marking its 50th anniversary as an authority, recounting how it absorbed the Philadelphia Transit Company in September 1968 and became the region's umbrella agency for buses, subways, and rail. In that same statement, SEPTA spoke of establishing an official archive, recognizing that the public and media had long asked for a place to access historical photos and information, and that such a place had not existed formally. The language is administrative and forward-looking, but the implication is clear. Even for the agency itself, the record has not been centralized. The system has been operating without a complete public memory of its own past. In that context, the story of sealed platforms becomes harder to reconstruct over time. If you cannot easily retrieve the history of a closure, the closure becomes something else, a rumor, a half-known fact, a story told differently by different generations of riders and workers. The Broad Ridge Spur remains an especially potent environment for that kind of half-memory. WHYY's description of its isolation is not simply a mood, it is a functional condition. The Spur has fewer riders, longer waits, and a persistent sense that the train you hear may not be yours. The station's LED messages, part schedule, part self-help aphorism, become a surrogate for human presence. A machine speaks into the silence. Sealed spaces intensify the effect. If you stand on a platform where part of the station is fenced off, you are not merely waiting for a train, you are waiting beside a visible absence. The fence does not hide what it blocks, it frames it. Streets Depth's observation about Fairmount, partially open, partially closed, reads, in hindsight, like a description of a system that has learned to amputate without removing. The closed portion remains physically present, and because it remains present, it continues to act on the mind. A rider can see that the station was once larger. A worker can see that the infrastructure was built with contingencies that are no longer used. The city can see the evidence of an earlier ambition, now managed as a liability. The sealed without warning aspect persists most strongly in the smallest details. Blocked stairways that once connected directly to the street, corridors that end abruptly, doors that look like they were installed in a hurry, patched tile that never quite matches. These are the artifacts of decisions made under pressure. Pressure from safety concerns, from unauthorized entry, from budget constraints, from liability, from the need to keep trains moving even when stations are being reduced behind the scenes. Billy Penn describes the Spur's recurring threats of cancellation and the way funding constraints shaped what was built and what was not built. The story of the Center City Loop, proposed, partially constructed, then curtailed, demonstrates a city that can begin a project and leave it incomplete for generations. Some sections get repurposed, some sections get sealed, some remain as dormant cavities under streets that most people will never connect to what lies beneath. There's also the practical reality that sealing is never final in an absolute sense. A sealed platform still requires inspection. It still requires occasional access for maintenance of adjacent infrastructure, ventilation, drainage, cables, structural supports. Each access is a reopening, however brief, and each reopening preserves the knowledge that the space remains there, intact enough to be dangerous. Street steps warning about disorientation underground becomes more relevant in the aftermath. The more spaces are sealed, the more the public routes become constrained, and the more the system becomes legible only to those who work it. A subway can become, for riders, a narrow channel through a much larger hidden structure. If you never see the larger structure, you can forget it exists. If you glimpse it through a fence, you cannot. This is the lasting psychological presence of the sealed platforms. They create a sense that the city has rooms it is not willing to acknowledge. An image of City Hall Station, bright enough to look ordinary, still communicates that it is built into the city's foundation in a way that does not feel temporary. It is an underground civic chamber. When a chamber like that contains sealed walls, the ceiling feels less like closure and more like concealment, even if the reason was mundane and necessary. The Broad Street line is not a haunted system in the conventional sense. The horror here is administrative and infrastructural. It is the awareness that a public system can create spaces, use them, abandon them, and then seal them so quickly that the public cannot agree on when it happened. It is the awareness that those spaces do not disappear. They remain adjacent to people's daily commutes, separated by a few inches of tile and a locked door. The camera takes a final, slow pass along a corridor that looks finished, maintained, and modern enough to reassure. Then it settles again on a patch of tile that does not match the rest, and holds there until the mismatch becomes the only thing visible. Behind it, the ventilation continues, trains continue. The system continues to move air through rooms that were built to hold crowds, and now hold nothing that is supposed to be there. The city above continues to walk on streets that were cut open and repaired nearly a century ago. And below, sealed platforms remain in place, silent, ordinary, and still part of the map, whether the public is allowed to see them or not.